Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 47th episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled Quakerism. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. So, for the teaching agenda today, first we'll have a disclaimer. Then we're going to talk about Quaker history, beliefs, distinct practices, worship, and church structure. And then we'll have a look at famous Quaker animal rights activists and vegetarians like Ann Sewell, Benjamin Lay, Joshua Evans, Anthony Benezet, and Ruth Harrison. And so getting into the disclaimer, of course, as usual, this is about Quakerism, and so this may marginalize other denominations or criticize other denominations. That's, of course, not meant to be insulting. It's just the reality of Quakers' experiences. If you feel offended at any point or feel like you need to stop listening, feel free to do so. There's no pressure to keep listening if you're offended or anything like that. But even though that's not the intention, but getting into this, who exactly are the Quakers? Are they the same as Friends? Because I know, like a lot of people, for instance, my sister-in-law went to Friends University, which is a Quaker university. So Friends and Quakers are sort of a terms that are interchangeable, but Friends or Quakers, either name will do, as they have the same meaning, as most easily described as those persons who belong to the religious society of Friends. But what exactly is Quakerism? Quaker was originally a nickname for those children of light or friends of truth, as they thought of themselves, friends of Jesus, as they call John 15:15. They got that from. But they were said to tremble or quake with religious zeal, and so the nickname stuck. So they called Quakers that because they would quake with religious zeal. And so Quakers is what the nickname would be. But in time, they came to be simply known as Friends. The religious society of Friends began in England about 1650 in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. So, of course, it's associated with the Protestant Reformation. It was when a youthful George Fox, it's a name you'll hear a lot, underwent a profound religious experience. Immediate, direct experience of God became the heart of his message and ministry, which inspired the Quaker movement. It was a religious protest against the hollow formalism, which for many made up the established church of that time. Seeking spiritual reality, these early Friends found that they could experience God directly in their lives without benefit of clergy or liturgy or steepled church. And so what do Friends believe? Do they have a creed? Quakers believe in an inward, immediate, and transforming experience of God, which is central to their faith. They turn to an inner guide or teacher for continuing revelation and direction. Some Friends identify this inner light, seed within or Christ within, as it has been variously called, with the historic Jesus. Others conceive of the inward guide as a universal spirit, which was in Jesus in abundant measure, is in everyone to some degree. That of God in everyone, as George Fox put it. The light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And so he got that from John 1:9. Quakers do not have a creed, but each of the regional groups of Quakers or yearly meetings has its own book of discipline or faith and practice, which includes general statements of belief, testimonies, or actions resulting from those beliefs. And the uniquely Quaker feature, which is known as advice and or queries. But how does the faith of Friends show in their personal lives? And so love of God and love of neighbor find expression in the varied forms of Quaker worship. In Friends' witness and historic testimonies, in their social attitudes and concerns, their mission and service outreach, their programs of education and action. For Friends, these are the fruits of their faith, the affirmation of the indwelling spirit and redemptive love, spiritual realities that they feel they do share and must share with others. And so very social concern, very Quakers tend to be very societally reformed focused, and that's something that you'll see throughout this teaching. But what are the principal concerns and activities of Friends? The belief that there is a potential for good in all persons, which I will say maybe disagree with that, as indeed also the capacity for evil, which I am more inclined to believe in. Friends sensitive to human degradation, ignorance, superstition, suffering, injustice, and exploitation. And like I said, something that you'll see throughout Quakerism teaching is this focus on social reform. Under a sense of concern, inner prompting, divine obedience, urgency, Friends are drawn to humanitarian callings, to programs of education and to projects of service and constructive action. And that's something too that you'll see a lot of times with Quakers is the more progressive, even probably the more conservative Quakers are a little bit more progressive than general society. They're definitely a more progressive variety of um, Christian of a Christian denomination. Early friends went out with the good news of their quickened faith to the American colonies, and they bore their message of truth to czar, sultan, and pope. So it kind of didn't matter what culture; they were very zealous and very forward with the gospel. And something that Quakers are very much associated with the colonial period within the Americas. Very, very early colonists were Quakers, tended to be. With changed perspectives, this witness continues in programs for sharing of human resources throughout the world, for more rapid social change by nonviolent means, for reform of the present system of criminal justice, for real equality of opportunity in employment, housing, and education, and for elimination of prejudice and discrimination against minority groups and the underprivileged. And so, what you see there too, very concerned about minority groups, the underprivileged, criminal justice, and they're always nonviolent as well. That's very much a Quaker maxim. The American Friends Service Committee plays an important part in furthering these Quaker concerns, which are indeed the continuing expression and action of historic Friends testimonies. What are the historic and continuing Quaker testimonies? The Quaker testimonies, what Friends have stood for publicly as a form of religious witness, derived from their central belief in the essential oneness and equality of all persons. This has found expression in simplicity of lifestyle, integrity in personal relations, and at times controversial stands on public issues. And so that's something that they do is they have a testimony which is a witness of their Christian faith. And a lot of times that has to do with concern of social justice. The peace testimony is perhaps the most widely known of these. Taken as a whole, the Society of Friends is strongly opposed to war and to conscription. And so a lot of times you'll see Quakers are very much conscientious objectors. They're very much against war. And so the peace testimony, it seeks to remove the causes of war. It tries to reconcile factions and nations, and it ministers to suffering on both sides of conflicts. It helps to rebuild at war's end. It witnesses creatively to the power of nonviolence in the movement for social change. So obviously this all is relevant to animal activism, and you'll see that in a little bit. But while there have indeed been fighting Quakers bearing arms in every American war, and some young Friends have accepted the draft, many declare themselves conscientious objectors, and some are active draft resistors. And another Friends testimony supports social justice. Quaker colonists in America were fair and friendly with their Native American neighbors, and they early advocated for the abolition of slavery. And that is, of course, something too that Quakers were very much involved in, was the abolition of slavery, and you'll see that later on. But today, Friends work actively for the rights of American Indians or Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other ethnic groups in the United States and Canada, and with indigenous peoples in Mexico and elsewhere throughout the world. And so how do people become members of the Society of Friends? Each individual friend holds membership in a particular Friends meeting or church, and this way belongs to the Society of Friends. That's what that's known as. Children born into Quaker homes and brought up in a Friends meeting or church may in time be accepted as adult members. Other persons who are attracted to membership by the faith, witness, or fellowship of Friends who feel themselves ready to become members of a Friends meeting or church by convincement or conversion or by transfer from another religious body are encouraged to apply for membership. There is such a wide range of conviction and belief within the Quaker framework that persons of quite dissimilar views may find somewhere within it their spiritual home, opportunity to worship and serve with others of the same persuasion. Speaking truth to each other in love as Christian neighbors would be the Quaker way for Friends. So I like how this article put it. It's kind of said that speaking truth to each other in love as Christian neighbors. That's how a Quaker would put it. And then another little bit of more background. Quakers, also known as the Religious Society of Friends, also referred to as the Quaker movement, was founded in England in the 17th century by George Fox. He and other early Quakers or Friends were persecuted for their beliefs. Quakers very much associated with persecution of their beliefs, which included the idea that the presence of God exists in every person. Quakers rejected elaborate religious ceremonies, didn't have official clergy, and believed in spiritual equality for men and women, which was very controversial at the time. Quaker missionaries first arrived in America in the mid-1650s, so very early American presence. Quakers who practiced pacifism played a key role in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. And so Quakers, as pacifists, are people who are against war. They played a key role in the movements to advance women's rights as well as to end slavery. And so that was very admirable and something that goes along well with animal rights activism. In the 1640s, George Fox, then a young man and son of a weaver, left his home in the English Midlands. Oh, excuse me, and traveled. Oh, excuse me. Appreciate it. Pause there. Thank you. Um, Left his home in the English Midlands and traveled around the country on a spiritual quest. It was a time of religious turmoil in England, with people seeking reform in the Church of England or starting their own competing churches. And so, over the course of his journey, as Fox met others searching for a more direct spiritual experience, he came to believe that the presence of God was found within people rather than in churches. He experienced what he referred to as openings, instances in which he felt God was talking directly to him. So, quite an interesting experience. Along with Quaker beliefs, Fox shared his religious beliefs and epiphanies with others, speaking to increasingly larger gatherings. And even though his views were viewed by some as a threat to society, and he was jailed for blasphemy in 1650, Fox and other early Quakers continued to share their beliefs. So they go along with the Protestant Reformation. They were persecuted for their beliefs. In 1652, he met Margaret Fell, who went on to become another leader in the early Quaker movement. So a woman involved that early, very, very admirable. Her home, which was Swarthmore Hall in northwest England, served as a gathering place for many of the first Quakers. Fox and Fell married in 1667. And meanwhile, Quaker emerged as a derisive nickname for Fox and others who shared his belief in the biblical passage that people should tremble at the word of the Lord. So that's where that derived from. They called them Quakers actually originally an insult. And then Fox actually thought that was biblical, because he said that in the Bible it says that there's a biblical passage that people should tremble at the word of the Lord. I actually don't know what passage that is, though, off the top of my head. Let me actually look at that real quick. Yeah, tremble at the word of God first. That is from Isaiah 66:2. I had a feeling, I was like, I bet that's Isaiah, but I wasn't totally sure. Typical poetry that Isaiah elaborates on. But the group eventually embraced the term, although their official nickname became Religious Society of Friends. And so it was originally an insult, and then it became something that they used as an admirable term. And so they took that as their own, as a Quaker. Members are referred to as Friends or Quakers. And so what is a Quaker? Quakerism continued to spread across Britain during the 1650s, and by 1660, there were around 50,000 Quakers, according to some estimates. And a number of Quaker beliefs were considered radical, such as the idea that women and men were spiritual equals, and women could speak out during worship. And so these were ideas that were very controversial at the time. Quakers didn't have official ministers or religious rituals, and they opted not to use honorific titles such as Your Lordship or My Lady. They rejected all of that in England. And based on their interpretation of the Bible, Quakers were pacifists and refused to take legal oaths. And so, again, that pacifism runs through the golden thread of Quakerism. And central to their beliefs was the idea that everyone had the light of Christ within them. Fox spent much of the 1660s behind bars, and by the 1680s, thousands of Quakers across the British Isles had dominated Massachusetts, where several Quakers, later known as the Boston Martyrs, were executed during the 1650s and 1660s. And so a lot of turmoil within the late 1600s. And then this is an important one, too, as a Pennsylvania resident. William Penn, in 1681, King Charles II gave William Penn, a wealthy English Quaker, a large land grant in America to pay off a debt owed to his family. Penn, who had been jailed multiple times for his Quaker beliefs, went on to found Pennsylvania as a sanctuary for religious freedom and tolerance. And so William Penn was a Quaker, and he founded the state of Pennsylvania, which is where I live, and I've lived my whole life. Within just a few years, several thousand Friends had moved to Pennsylvania from Britain. Quakers were heavily involved in Pennsylvania's new government and held positions of power in the first half of the 18th century before deciding their political participation was forcing them to compromise some of their beliefs, including pacifism. And it's interesting, too, because Pennsylvania is actually consistently listed as one of the most corrupt states in the nation, the top 5. And so I think that William Penn and the early Quakers that helped found this state would be very disappointed in the legislature for the stuff that they've pulled over the last couple of years. But Quakers and human rights, the Quakers took up their cause of protecting Native Americans' rights, creating schools and adoption centers. Relations between the two groups weren't always friendly, however, as many Quakers insisted upon Native American assimilation into Western culture. Um, Quakers were also early abolitionists, and I really like this part. In 1758, Quakers in Philadelphia were ordered to stop buying and selling slaves, and so that was very early. 1758. Slavery was abolished in the United States around 1865, or in 1865. By the 1780s, all Quakers were barred from owning slaves. So that was very early. That was almost 100 years before slavery was abolished. In the 19th century, many leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the United States were Quakers, including Lucretia Mott and Alice Paul. So Alice Paul, she was a women's suffragette, and she was also a Quaker. Um, and she actually was featured in the movie Iron Jawed Angels. She was played by Hilary Swank, and I don't think the movie went into her Quakerism at all, but nonetheless, she was portrayed a very fierce and uncompromising woman in her beliefs, which was very admirable. But famous Quakers to date, 2 United States presidents have been Quakers, and I didn't know this actually, but Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon were both Quakers. Unfortunately, Richard Nixon's reputation has been sort of marred. Maybe that's why the Quakers didn't maybe advertise that. But other famous people who were raised as Quakers or participated in the religion include author James Michener, philanthropist John Hopkins, who the hospital is named after, actresses, I'm sorry, actress Judi Dench and actor James Dean were Quakers. Musician Bonnie Raitt and Joan Baez. Bonnie Raitt sang the song "I Can't Make You Love Me," as well as "Something to Talk About." I have those on my music list, as well as John Cadbury, who founded the chocolate business bearing his name. So Cadbury Chocolate, he was a Quaker. And then there's also too, I think Quaker oatmeal has a relation to Quakerism. I couldn't remember the exact reason, but actually, let me look that up real quick because I was kind of curious. I forgot to look that up, but yeah, Quaker Oats belongs to PepsiCo today, but the brand was created in 1877 for a cereal mill in Ohio. The story goes that the founders, Henry Seymour and William Heston, had read about Quakers and our reputation for good quality, honesty, and integrity, and wanted to associate that with their product. So that's kind of interesting, sort of related but not related to Quakerism. And so, yeah, Quaker Oats were not made by Quakers. So it's kind of interesting. It's because that the Quakers had such a good reputation that the Oats Company was named after them. And they have, I always thought that it was related to Quakerism because they have the hat that Quakers typically would wear in previous generations. But today, there are approximately 400,000 Quakers around the world by some estimates, with the highest percentage in Africa. So it's a relatively small denomination. There's Catholic Church and a lot of the other Protestant groups are in the millions, but there are different branches of Quakerism. Some have programmed worship services that are led by pastors, while the others practice unprogrammed worship, which is done in silence. Those who are inspired can speak without the guidance of a pastor. Unprogrammed Friends refer to their congregations as meetings, while programmed Quakers use the term meeting as well as church to refer to their congregations. Many, but not all, Quakers consider themselves Christians, and that probably has to do more with the politics. But most Quakers have abandoned the plain style of clothing they once wore, unlike the Amish, with whom Quakers are sometimes confused. And so the Quakers have those hats that you'll see with the clothing that's pretty distinctive that you see on Quaker oatmeal, but nonetheless, they've sort of abandoned that, unlike the Amish. And then there's the source material for that as well, too, the history.com. But this article was pretty interesting, too. What is a Quaker? A brief history of Quakerism. You may recall learning something about the Quaker movement in school, as they were one of the many active and influential groups during the founding of our nation. Their significance, however, reaches well beyond their brief mention in most school history books. The Quakers were pioneers of ideas that have greatly influenced our culture and have actively participated in the pursuit of a more just society by embracing their distinctive values. In this post, we'll explore the origins of this exceptional community, their distinguished beliefs, and how they have manifested their convictions in the world around them. And so, who were the Quakers and where did they come from? The Quakers originated in England during the mid-17th century, which was a period of significant turmoil. England was undergoing political instability due to their civil war and the execution of King Charles I, and various groups inspired by the Reformation were breaking away from the official church and forging their own paths. George Fox, the founder of the Quaker religion, like other reformers of the time, was disillusioned by the state church and sought a more vibrant and authentic expression of faith. He preached a message of returning to a simpler Christianity that moved away from the complexity and hierarchy of the existing church. And so he was talking about, I believe, Anglicanism there. His followers were eager to spread his teachings to others, and the group grew rapidly. He also probably was criticizing the Catholicism in England. However, the authorities did not approve of their beliefs and frequently persecuted the early Quakers, even in the New England colonies where many had immigrated. It wasn't until William Penn, a Quaker himself, founded Pennsylvania in 1681 and proclaimed religious liberty that the Quakers finally had a place where they could practice their faith freely. Their voices became an essential part of colonial America. And another interesting thing about Pennsylvania, too, our state school, the University of Pennsylvania, which is known as Penn, University of Penn, their nickname is actually the Quakers. So it's kind of cool. There's a lot of connections to Quakerism with Pennsylvania. But like I said, very disappointing that our state legislator is so corrupt, given that the early Quakers were something that was not founded on. But early Quaker beliefs, what were the particular convictions of this group that both contributed to their viability and created so much opposition? The early Quakers had unique perspectives on the relationship between the individual and God, as well as on how we relate to with one another. Individual access to the divine during Fox's era, the connection between God and individuals was mediated by the complex institution of the church, with its priests, obscure theology, and rigid ceremonies. Conversely, Fox believed that God was accessible to anyone by looking inward and being attentive to what he called the inner light. He emphasized that the key to hearing God's guidance was to be tranquil and attentive, listening to the inner voice. The equality of all persons. Quakers believed in the equality of all persons because they held the conviction that every individual possessed this inner light. They believed that the inner light was the source of individual inspiration and guidance, and that it was not limited by gender, race, social status, or any other external factors. So that obviously lends to a lot of their social justice pursuits. Therefore, Quakers rejected social hierarchies and institutionalized discrimination, as they saw such practices as violations of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. This belief in equality was a central tenet of the Quaker faith and continues to influence the movement's values and practices to this day. A faith that changes one's life. And so finally, Quakers felt deeply that an authentic faith should show itself in a changed life. These beliefs weren't just intellectual ideas, but principles that should guide how we live. From the beginning, Quakers wanted to change the world around them to make it a place where our basic equality is recognized by the culture and its institutions. The Quaker testimonies are often simplified into the acronym SPICES, which is simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equity or equality, service, and stewardship. Convictions lived out, so the impact of Quaker beliefs, the distinctive emphases that characterized their origins had a profound impact not just on the Quakers, but on the world they inhabited as they tried to follow where their convictions led. And so here are some areas where the influence of the Religious Society of Friends, the official name of the Quakers, has been felt. Equal treatment of women. At the start, Quakers gave women a much more prominent place than was typical in other religious organizations, so very admirable. Women like Margaret Fell spoke publicly, published religious literature, and took part in leadership. In fact, many of the early leaders for women's suffrage in the U.S., like Lucretia Mott, were Quakers. Abolishing slavery and freeing enslaved people. The Quakers' belief in the equal dignity of all persons was in obvious tension with the practice of enslaving people. Those living in the American colonies reached an official consensus in 1755 to prohibit the ownership of enslaved people among themselves, and later petitioned the newly formed United States government to do the same. Quaker abolitionists like John Woolman, who we'll talk about in a bit, were instrumental in the eventual end of slavery in both the U.S. and Great Britain. So Quakers were just very influential in abolishing slavery. Pacifism. During a time marked by violence and conflict, George Fox declared the Quaker stance of abstaining from participation in violent acts. Since then, Quakers have consistently pursued peace and avoided taking up arms against others. Conscientious objectors. Their pursuit of peace is not passive, however. Quakers work actively to resolve conflicts, advocate for change, and care for victims of injustice. And then the Religious Society of Friends was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 in recognition of their contribution to meeting the needs of those affected by both world wars. So it's pretty amazing that the Friends actually were given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947, and that's a testament to how peaceful their religious stances often are. Business. Quakers were often transformative in the world of business as well because their integrity, simplicity, and close-knit community or fertile soil for efficient and innovative business practices. They were important leaders in the Industrial Revolution in England, building enterprises including Cadbury Chocolate, as well as Lloyd's Bank. Their commitment to equality also influenced how they treated their employees. And so Quakers led the way in providing better working conditions and caring for the needs of those who worked for them. And then who are the Quakers today? Today, Quakers are a diverse group with members living all over the globe. What ties different Quakers together is their continuing commitment to principles like the importance of finding one's inner light, the equality of all people who need to live their convictions out in the world, and the pursuit of peace. And so their desire to live out their convictions too, that lends very favorably to the First Amendment in the United States, because probably a lot of them were very big advocates of, I should be able to express myself and express my beliefs. And that's something that's very foundational to the United States. For now, I should say. No, I'm just kidding. But getting into, and you might ask, well, what does this have to do with animal rights? And a lot of this Quakerism and a lot of their beliefs have led very positively to animal rights. And so a little summary, Bless the Beast, the article was called, but it says Quakers have a long history of advocating for animal rights. They became the first denomination to establish such an organization within their faith group when the Friends Anti-Vivisection Association, now known as Quaker Concern for Animals, was founded in 1891, and they still actually exist today. Quaker Concern for Animals. By then, individual Quakers had long been involved in the secular animal rights movement. Carolyn Earl White was a co-founder of the Pennsylvania Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1867, the first state SPSA after the ASPCA formed just a year earlier, and also founded the American Anti-Vivisection Society. Also, the Friends Vegetarian Society was founded in 1902, but individual Quakers chose to live meat-free lifestyles centuries earlier, including anti-slavery activists, these names will come up again, Anthony Benezet, Joshua Evans, and of course, Benjamin Lay. And so it's pretty amazing. The Quakers actually founded the very first Christian anti-vivisection group, which is, they were against animal experimentation. And Christianity has a very long history of opposing animal experimentation for a very, very long time. And including many big voices like C.S. Lewis spoke out against it. Many Quaker journals describe formative experiences, such as that of John Woolman, one of America's most famous Quaker ministers. Struck with remorse after killing a mother bird as a boy, he traveled hundreds of miles on foot as an adult, rather than ride on stagecoaches pulled by mistreated horses. And perhaps the Quaker who had the greatest impact on improving animal welfare was Anna Sewell, whose 1877 novel Black Beauty, the autobiography of a horse, is sometimes referred to as the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the animal rights movement. It had such a big impact on how people thought of animals. And I love the movie. With its frank depictions, of the cruel treatment endured by taxi pulling horses, Black Beauty sparked an international movement, directly led to animal protection legislature, and remains one of the world's all-time best-selling books. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. But Anna Sewell, very, very influential. But that also was probably what led to eventually cars taking the place of horses in the streets. And even though it's sort of a novelty issue right now, many cities have banned horse carriages like Chicago, Malaga, Spain, San Antonio. New York City is still struggling, even though most of the community wants it banned. Quaker animal rights champions. This article is fascinating. Joshua Evans, he lived from 1731 to 1793. Joshua Evans was a Quaker minister and abolitionist from New Jersey. Evans and his thoughts are representatives of a radical, primitive Quaker tradition and reflect the diversity of late 18th century Quakerism. Evans' 1762 journal particularly addressed his inspiration for being a vegetarian and against animal cruelty. We'll get to him in a bit. Sarah Norcliffe Cleghorn, she lived from 1876 to 1959. Sarah Norcliffe Cleghorn was a Quaker author, reformer, and pacifist from Vermont and Philadelphia. She was active in the anti-vivisection movement, as well as other reform efforts for peace, women's suffrage, anti-lynching, prison reform, and opposition to child labor. John Woolman, he lived from 1720 to 1772, which we mentioned before. John Woolman wrote about poultry and livestock, particularly on transatlantic voyages. For example, on his 1772 journey to England, Woolman noted that some chickens were ill, while others were carried overboard. He wrote that the love of God is verily protected or perfected. A care is felt in us that we do not lessen that sweetness of life in the animal creation. So very kind words from John Woolman, expressing concern about chickens that were being transported for slaughter. Woolman recommends that lading fewer fowl and thereby eating less meat would accord with pure wisdom. Benjamin Lay, this guy's really interesting. He lived from 1682 to 1759. Benjamin Lay is most associated with abolition, but he was also a vegetarian. You can read more about his vegetarian and advocacy for animal rights in Marcus Rediker's The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist, which was published in 2017. And he was called they say that he was the Quaker dwarf because he was a short guy. That was what the author was referring to. But Marcus Rediker, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, this was a review done August 1st, 2022 by Gabriel Carlisle. But he wrote, given the prominent role played by Quakers in anti-slavery movements, it may come as a surprise to some readers to learn that this struggle first had to be fought and won within Quaker communities. Yet when Benjamin Lay and his wife Sarah arrived in Philadelphia in 1732, more than half the members of the Philadelphia Monthly Meeting owned slaves. In 1738, Benjamin was to become the last Quaker disowned for protests against slavery. Yet it wasn't until 20 years later that Quakers agreed to the possibility of disowning a member for slave trading, and an additional 18 years to begin to excommunicate the slave owners. One of the reasons for these changes was Lay himself, who for a quarter century railed against slavery in one Quaker meeting after another, in and around Philadelphia, confronting slave owners and slave traders with a savage, most un-Quaker-like fury. So for as small as he was full of feist. Really interesting guy, but born in Essex in 1682 in the village of Catford, that's England. Lay came from a humble background and was poor for most of his life. Self-educated with little formal schooling, he worked variously as a shepherd, a glover, a sailor, in which capacity he traveled the globe, and a bookseller. He was also a little over 4 feet tall and a hunchback with a rounding of the middle of the spine called kyphosis. And that didn't slow him down, of course. But Rediker writes that he found no evidence that Lay thought himself in any way diminished, nor that his body kept him from doing anything he wanted to do. It was the 18 months that the Lays spent in Barbados, then the world's leading slave society, that transformed Benjamin. And I believe Barbados, I think that's down in the Caribbean, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just look. I think I might have looked that up before. I can't remember. Barbados, yeah, country in the Caribbean. So that was a hot spot for the slave trade, but he spent time there. But the couple had set up a small dockside shop there in 1718, but horrified by what they were witnessing, Benjamin and Sarah started holding meetings and serving meals at their homes, attended by ever larger crowds of enslaved people, at which the Lays would denounce slavery. The Lays left Barbados in 1720, and when they finally settled in Philadelphia, Benjamin was horrified to find the greatest sin in the world flourishing in the city of brotherly love. It was not long before he came into conflict with the weighty Quakers, many of them slave owners who led the religious and political life of the city and colony. Lay began to stage public protests, often in the form of guerrilla theater. And this is funny because it says, for example, one Sunday following a heavy snowfall, he stood outside of a meeting house with his uncovered right leg and foot buried in the snow. When his fellow Quakers urged him to desist, he replied, "Ah, you pretend compassion for me, but you do not feel for the poor slaves in your fields who go all winter half clad." And so it was kind of funny. He would goad these Quakers into his concern because of his foot in the snow. It was uncovered, and yet he accused them of hypocrisy because their slaves are out in the snow without any clothing. And so I like this guy. He really fires me up. But Lay also disrupted Quaker meetings in and around Philadelphia. Indeed, the fearless Benjamin Lay opens with an account of perhaps his most spectacular protest in September 1738 at the biggest event of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. After rising and denouncing slave ownings, Lay threw off his greatcoat to reveal himself to be wearing a military uniform and carrying a sword and a book. "Thus shall God shed the blood of those who enslave their fellow creatures," he cried, before plunging the sword into the book from which blood, which was actually pokeberry juice hidden in a secret compartment, then appeared to pour. Lay was picked up and removed from the building. And so he was highly dramatic and very attention-getting with his antics. But that same year, 1738, Lay also published one of the world's first books to demand the abolition of slavery. All slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage, apostates. Benjamin wrote his book at a time when slavery seemed to many people around the world as natural and unchangeable as the sun, the moon, and the stars in the heavens. Redeker notes that no one had ever taken such a militant, uncompromising stand against slavery in print or in action. And if all of the above wasn't, and if all of the above wasn't already enough, he was also a vegetarian and a proponent of animal rights. And he famously said, "Would you have me eat my neighbors?" He once replied when asked to dine on poultry. He was an environmentalist and an opponent of the death penalty. But Lay died in 1759, and the Quakers finally supported abolition in 1776. And Redeker writes that Lay is little known among historians and almost totally unknown to the general public. I, for one, had never heard of it. And hopefully, this remarkable must-read book will go a considerable way to changing this. And so that was from that source, from peacenews.info. But I thought that was really great. He really fired me up with that. And a lot of, he actually reminds me of several animal rights activists that we have here in Pittsburgh that are just fearless, uncompromising, and very stern and feisty in their beliefs. And I love that. And Luke Daniels said, "Hi, Matthew, just tuning in." Thank you, Luke. Love to have you. Thank you so much for attending. Love your posts, by the way. I always love your advocacy for veganism and other Christian issues that go along with that. This one's really fascinating, too. Another Quaker I really admire, Anna Sewell. The Christian didacticism of animal treatment and Anna Sewell's Black Beauty. Anna Sewell's Black Beauty is a beloved story that has been appreciated since 1877 for its timeless significance and empathetic storytelling. And I love the movie, by the way. It's actually one of my favorite movies. Really, really sweet movie. There's many versions, but the 90s version is what I'm referring to. But the novel is from a first-person perspective of our horse protagonist, Beauty. It follows his stages of life as he has passed between masters, some cruel and some kind. The qualities of these masters reflect the theme of the children's novel, which is a lesson all about the importance of being kind to all of God's creations. 2 years after the release of the novel, 1 million copies of Black Beauty were in circulation in the United States. Sewell criticizes the use of blinders, check reins, or the shortening of a horse's tail for fashion. The outrage from readers resulting in the check rein being abolished from Victorian England. Legislations in various states were developed to prevent these abuses, and in the Encyclopedia of Animal Rights and Animal Welfare, Bernard Unti calls Black Beauty the most influential anti-cruelty novel of all time. Sewell once lived for a few months after her book's publication. The subtitle of Black Beauty, His Grooms and Companions, the Autobiography of a Horse, informs us that the book is written in a memoir style that chronicles the horse's life experiences, and the former part emphasizes the importance of the impact his masters had on his life. The personification of the animals in the story that are affected by human cruelty creates an emotional connection that develops empathy for animals, helping readers to understand why the mistreatment of animals is wrong. This piece of children's literature is also the first autobiography from the vantage point of an animal. It acts as a didactic text with Christian influence, reflecting the nature of children's literature in the time it was written. And didactic means teaching. Sewell was born in 1820 in Yarmouth, England, and at the age of 14, she broke her ankle, which permanently disabled her and put her in bad health for the entirety of her life. Probably a big reason why she empathized with animals. Because of her mobility issues, she relied heavily on horses for transportation, developing her connection with them and opening her eyes to their mistreatment at the hands of cruel owners. Later on, her health condition worsened and she was bedridden, which motivated her to put her efforts into writing about a Victorian issue she was passionate about: the cruel treatment of horses and disregard for their well-being. Sewell says the purpose of her writing in the novel is to induce kindness, sympathy, and understanding treatment of horses. And as a Quaker, Sewell appeals to religious morality as Christianity was the dominant religion of the time, and the novel essentially functions as a didactic text for this reason. The 1994 adaptation of Black Beauty was directed and written by Carolyn Thompson and gave further attention to the issues brought forth in the novel. It visualizes the key scenes, and the beautiful movie poster makes Beauty look heroic and endearing, highlighting her human connection. The retelling of the story through the creation of multiple movie adaptations reinforces the message for modern children in an accessible way. It shows that the novel is truly timeless and stays in the hearts of many. The adaptations of children's literature continues their legacy and preserves their relevance for modern-day children. So that was the source on that. But I love that movie actually too because it's just really sweet. Like it shows this horse because he passes from multiple masters to pull a carriage throughout England. And then at the end, he's reunited with one of the masters that was very kind to him. And spoilers, even though you've had sort of 30 years to see the movie, but he finds this one that was really kind to him, and then he lets him live on his property, free to just do what he wants, with fences and stuff. And at the ending, it just shows him laying in the grass, very content. And it's just a really sweet movie. I highly recommend the movie if you haven't watched it. And he finally finds peace from this man that gave him a lot of care and attention when he was under his care, and then he lets him basically live at a sanctuary for the rest of his life. So it's a very sweet story, very winsome. And then I want to talk about Joshua Evans, 1731 to 1798. He lived. He was a Quaker minister who practiced vegetarianism. He advocated against slavery and supported abolition. And so a lot of very logical consistency in this too. Evans promoted ethical veganism on the basis of biblical ethics and Quaker ideals of temperance. Evans believed that humans do not have sovereignty over the life of God's creatures. In his journal, he recalls what John Locke had to say about slavery, that humans are the property of God, and therefore they cannot enslave each other. But explicitly, he expands this discourse to include other than human animals. It is partly for this reason that Evans claims to be wary of taking the life of and eating animals. So it's very impressive. A Quaker actually extended the idea that we do not have the right to take animal life to animals as well. He also refers to the passage in Genesis that also suggests that all beings were created vegan, their meat being every herb and bearing seed. And so he linked his veganism to Genesis 1:29, which is that God said that humans were designed to only eat plants. He links ethical veganism with frugality, as diet is an important component in his ideal of frugality. And so there's the source on that. And I found this really cool article. It says Vegetarianism in Quaker History. Many Quakers view reflection upon food ethics as a relatively recent phenomenon, but in reality, such discernment has been an important part of the tradition of Friends for centuries. Numerous Quaker abolitionists in the 1700s, for example, were deeply committed to vegetarianism as an integral part of their spiritual path at a time when vegetarianism was very rare in the broader culture. One such committed vegetarian Quaker was my guy, Benjamin Lay, whose life and witness has received much attention in the last couple years since the publication of The Fearless Benjamin Lay by the historian Marcus Rediker. Lay was one of the first people in history to call for the total abolition of slavery. Lay's commitment to respecting all of God's creatures also led him to a deep concern for non-human animals. It was said of him that his tender conscience would not permit him to eat any food, nor wear any garment, nor use any article which was procured at the expense of animal life. And so that's amazing that he was an abolitionist, fearlessly spoke, and was also a very committed vegetarian or vegan. Another vegetarian Quaker abolitionist was Joshua Evans, a contemporary of and influence upon the thought of John Woolman. He said, I consider that life was sweet in all creatures, Evans states, and taking it away became a very tender point with me. My spirit was often bowed in awful reverence before the Most High, and covered with feelings of humility and tenderness, Evans relates, out of which experiences it was revealed that I ought to no longer partake of anything that had life. And so because of his reverence for God, he decided that he no longer wanted to participate in taking the life of an animal. Anthony Benezet, another well-known Quaker abolitionist, similarly adopted a vegetarian diet, commenting that he had formed a kind of league of amity and peace with the animal creation. So I thought that was really cool. Anthony Benezet was a very well-known Quaker abolitionist, and he said that he had made peace and amity with the animal creation, and so he desired to not take any animal's life. And so that's something that's very connected too. There's a lot of very similar. You'll notice that a lot of abolitionists were vegan or vegetarian because they noticed that the injustice that we doled upon humans was also done to animals as well. So there's this very logical consistency that goes with it, and it's kind of like what Paul Watson, the famous animal rights activist from Sea Shepherd, said. He said, if you want to know where you would have stood on the issue of slavery, don't look where you stand on slavery today. Look at where you stand on animal rights. And it's true because there's a lot of connective tissue between those two issues. And I, for one, I do feel that I would have been an outspoken abolitionist, just like I'm an outspoken outspoken animal rights advocate. And so there's a lot of connective tissue there. And it's something that slavery always made my blood boil when I learned about it in school. And I can tell that I think that I would have been a very active abolitionist. Um, and that's not the virtue signal. It's just, because I'm so committed to animal rights, I can see that there's a connective tissue between it. But John Woolman shared similar sentiments concerning the status of animals as beloved creatures of God. To say we love God is unseen and at the time exercised cruelty toward the least creature moving by his life or by life derived from him, said Woolman, was a contradiction in itself. And so he was basically saying that we cannot love God and also exercise cruelty to animals. And while there's no evidence that Woolman ever became fully vegetarian, like Lay, Evans, and Benezet, it was written by a friend that Woolman had seldom eaten flesh. And so he sounded like he was a pretty close to vegetarian. It seemed like he didn't eat meat very often, which, hey, that the fact that he made any kind of noticeable step means, a lot when most people just ignore the issue. Woolman also demonstrated his concern for animals in other ways, for example, by walking in all of his travels through England in order to avoid contributing to cruelty to horses in the stagecoach industry. And so he was an active boycotter of horse carriages. Quaker leaders of the movement for women's right to vote in a later time period were also vegetarian. Among these women was Alice Paul, who was portrayed by Hilary Swank in Iron Jawed Angels. She was a notable women's suffragette. She was a key figure in the movement for women's suffrage and other struggles for women's equality in the United States. Speaking of her decision to become vegetarian, Alice Paul stated, "It occurred to me that I just didn't see how I could go ahead and continue to eat meat. It just seems so cannibalistic to me. And so I'm a vegetarian and have been since that time." So a very admirable woman, again, makes the very obvious connection between the rights of women's and the rights of animals, and that the women are degraded similar to in a way that animals are degraded. And so it's an obvious connective tissue, and that's what a lot of Quakers have made the connection to. Similarly, many leaders. I read that. It says similarly, many leaders of the movement for women's suffrage in England were vegetarian, including numerous Quakers. The Society of Friends was the first Christian denomination to form a faith-based vegetarian association, establishing the Friends Vegetarian Society in 1902. I'm not sure if that still exists today, but our friends at Christian Vegetarian Association probably have a lot of Quaker information. But Quakers had previously also played a major role in the formation of the Vegetarian Society of England in 1847. This embrace of a vegetarian diet has been shared by many other spiritually motivated nonviolent reformers throughout history. So obvious connective tissue. While concern for animals has clearly historically been the main motivation for Quaker vegetarianism, in more recent years, other important and compelling concerns have been added as well. These include recognition of the benefits of vegetarianism to human health, the environment, and world hunger. As the Christian Vegetarian Association, our friends, states, modern animal-based diets tend to significantly harm our health, the environment, and the world's poor and hungry and animals. Since a plant-based diet helps to address these concerns, we see it as an opportunity to honor God. Very well put by our friends at CVA, Christian Vegetarian Association. And then briefly, I just wanted to touch on Anthony Benezet, I mentioned earlier. He lived from January 31st, 1713. He was born in San Quentin, Aisne, France, and then he died May 3rd, 1784 in Philadelphia. But he was a Franco-American, so he's born in France. He was French, American Quaker, abolitionist, vegan advocate of animal rights and for the education of formerly enslaved people. So quite amazing. He was a Quaker, an abolitionist, a vegan advocate for animal rights and for the education of formerly enslaved people. He occasionally published under the pseudonym Lover of Mankind. The text Nature, the Best Physician weaves together his views on Christianity, anti-war, and anti-slavery. For Benezet, humanity is defined not only by the possession of reason, but also the capacity for sympathy, which is absent in the practitioners of slavery, and thus accounts for the dehumanizing effects of slavery. And so he says that basically people who are slave owners lack sympathy. He links the consumption of meat figuratively to the dangers of alcohol consumption and of war. So he criticized meat, associating it with the dangers of alcohol and war. And so there's the source on that. And then I think this is the ending of it, but Ruth Harrison, she's sort of a modern day figure. Ruth Harrison, a lifelong Quaker who served in the Friends Ambulance Unit during World War II, profoundly influenced the animal welfare and emerging vegan movement with her groundbreaking 1964 book, Animal Machines. The seminal work exposed the suffering of farm animals in intensive agriculture, leading to changes in UK and European farming policy, inspiring Peter Singer's 1975 book, Animal Liberation. This book also influenced Ingrid Newkirk, the co-founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, saying that it changed her life. And so Ruth Harrison, the Quaker, changed Ingrid Newkirk's life. And she said, if one person is unkind to an animal, it is considered to be cruelty. But where a lot of people are unkind to animals, especially in the name of commerce, the cruelty is condoned, and once large sums of money are at stake, will be defended to the last by otherwise intelligent people. And that was Ruth Harrison, her observation in Animal Machines, her book published in 1964. And I actually found this article about her. It's called Ruth and the Ruthless. Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, remains one of the most durable and damning indictments of factory farming. And that's one I actually haven't read. Anna Kendall presents a portrait of the author who campaigns tirelessly against the iniquities of intensive animal husbandry. Ruth Harrison is not a very public person, despite the publicity that is flared around her from time to time. A long and hard campaign against factory farming has affected her natural reserve, but her methods have never been those of the advertising agent. If they had been, she could have slipped into the headlines much more often. I admire this. Reason and fact, rather than emotion, are her weapons. And her opponents, no doubt much to her irritation, have never been able to write her off as another animal crank. She is careful, for instance, to distinguish between factory farming and intensive farming. What transformed a housewife, and trite as the description is, that is what she was, into the country's leading expert on factory farming was almost an accident. And this is interesting. This goes to show you the power of speaking out even in the smallest and easiest form. A leaflet through the door from the crusade against all cruelty to animals in the late 1950s. So she received a leaflet from underneath her door from an animal rights organization back in the 1950s, and that's what made her aware of factory farming, and then wrote an entire book about it and sparked a revolution. So you never know exactly how small, even your smallest action might have a ripple effect through time. It's like I was talking to my wife about how, we never really truly know the impact that we have when we speak out for animals. Some of our biggest actions might have no impact, and some of our smallest actions might change the course of history. And so you never can quite know what you're going to do for animals. But just keep speaking out and good things will happen. Until then, her concern had been with people rather than animals. I would argue humans rather than animals, because animals are people too. Although she had been brought up to be a vegetarian, her mother had become revolted by the sightings she saw in the open slaughterhouses she passed every day on her way to school. It was not, however, until Ruth read the Crusades leaflet on factory farming that she felt impelled to take more decisive action. I could not permit suffering to continue, or I could actually do something about it, she says now. Ruth Harrison also happens to be a Quaker. She joined the Society of Friends early on in World War II when she was a student of Bedford College, London. She evacuated to Cambridge. One of the attractions was its freedom, not tied to any particular dogma. I like the feeling that the voice of conscience can be made known to each one of us. The voice was there, and fate took a hand in the selection of a cause. The outcome was a book, Animal Machines, published in 1964 after a year's hard writing. This authoritative and lucid exposure of the evils of factory farming so disturbed Christopher Soames, then Minister of Agriculture, that he called a press conference on the morning of publication. So amazing. It affected governments. That's how influential it was. Animal welfare work absorbs a great deal of her time today. Mrs. Harrison has always been a realist and welcomes improvements that some people might regard as derisory. For example, under a factory system, pregnant sows are kept closely confined in bare concrete floor stalls. It's like keeping a dog in prison all of his life in a bare-floored kennel, for pigs are as intelligent as dogs. But if straw is spread over the concrete, then the sow can at least indulge one instinct, which is to root. This is the sort of small concession that Mrs. Harrison never undervalues. And I really agree with her there too, because that's something that I go back and forth with even in my mind and with other people, is the value of abolition versus the value of abolition versus welfare. And like our ministry right now is working on a cage-free campaign against multiple different outlets to not sell hens, eggs that involved hens being put in cages. And of course, that idea influences the idea that somehow eggs are acceptable if they're done differently. But at the same time, it's also making it far less cruel to have the hens out in open space rather than not being able to spread their wings. And so, what do you do? What is the right answer? I don't know. Do you? I'm always under the persuasion. It's like I'm a big football fan. I always say, take what the defense gives you. And so, if a company's willing to say, okay, we're not going to stop selling eggs no matter what you say, and that's sort of where we're at right now with veganism and animal rights. But if someone says, you know what, I'll drop the cages, I'm going to take it. And maybe that's not the right answer. I don't know. It seems like the right answer to me. Any small effort that we can make to make animals comfortable or make it a little bit better, I think that we should take it. That doesn't mean that we stop, though. We can still stop. We can still keep trying for abolition, but nothing ever is done all at once. It's always done incrementally, and I think that's something that we can look for. And she even says it here. She said, Mrs. Harrison never undervalues. She says one has to recognize that it took 30 years to get rid of child labor. If you adopt a very extreme position, you could put the whole fight back. You're going to offend people whatever you do, she said philosophically. You have to almost be a lone fighter. One aspect of her investigations over the years has been slaughter, a curious subject perhaps for a vegetarian, but completely in line with her policy of finding out exactly what happens as a prelude to improving things. She has seen it in many countries, from the instant decapitation of the Sikh method in India, probably one of the most humane forms, to the stunning and throat slitting of our own broiler chicken factories and the captive bolt pistol of our abattoirs. She is alarmed about failures of stunning equipment, with the possibility that an animal may go to its death fully conscious and terrified, although paralyzed, and wants to see a lot more research into stunning methods, with statutory testing of equipment before it is put on the market. Farm animals have experienced much the same kind of emotions as man: joy, fear, pain, suffering. I myself feel repugnance at the thought of eating them, but this is something people have to come to by themselves. And so that was actually featured in our very own allcreatures.org. They republished that article about Ruth Harrison. And so that's the end of my presentation. Actually, I actually had this one was, I of course think that all my teachings are interesting, although the general public might not. But I found this one to be even more enjoyable because of all of the social justice that was associated with the Quakers. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them through. I just have a couple of more minutes. I can close out in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing me to teach about your denomination, which I think glorifies you, which is Quakerism, and help us to be inspired by some of the people in Quakerism that have fought for social justice, like Benjamin Lay and Anthony Benesett and Alice Paul. Help us to be inspired by them and to continue to fight for justice and to create a world that you depict in Isaiah 11:6-9, where humans and animals no longer harm each other. But I don't have any questions or anything come through, but thank you guys so much for attending. I hope you enjoyed this teaching. And then I believe in 2 weeks, I'll be talking about Anabaptism. That'll be the next focus in 2 weeks. So I'll be here talking about that. And have a great Sunday. Enjoy your week ahead. And I'll see you here in 2 weeks. But have a great rest of your day and week.